Hello, my name's Annette Jäckle. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors and also the ESRC, the organization that funded this research. So this presentation is about how to get sample members to participate in data collection using mobile apps. Now, there are a few previous studies that generally have found that when we invite samples of the general population to collect data using mobile apps, then participation rates tend to be quite low. So here are some examples from different longitudinal studies in Germany, Great Britain, the Netherlands, that have asked their respondents to do something additional using a mobile app. And generally, participation rates have been very low. There are also some studies that have found that how we invite people can really matter. So the first here is a study we carried out where we found out that in a face-to-face interview, it really matters how we invite. So if we send people a letter after the interview, we get a low participation rate for the app study. If we invite them to the app study within the face-to-face interview, we get a much higher participation rate. So here we had 9% compared to 29%. In a web survey, this didn't matter. So whether we sent an invitation letter after the web survey or we invited sample members during the web survey, that didn't affect participation rates. And then in a study by McCall and colleagues, they found that it really matters who they invite. So if they recruited a new sample, they got a participation rate of 27%. When they invited respondents who had already completed a previous survey, they got a much higher participation rate. So this is just to say that participation rates are low, but we can influence them with the protocols that we use for implementing the app study. So that's what we're looking at in this paper. How do we best implement mobile app-based data collection? And we're experimenting with several aspects of the survey protocols. So this study was called the Wellbeing App Study. We implemented this in the Understanding Society Innovation Panel annual interview. So this was carried out in July to November 2020, and the annual interviews were sequential mixed mode. So invited people to complete the survey online, and then if they didn't do that, they were followed up by CATI interviewers. So as part of this annual interview, we then asked people to do an additional task to download this Wellbeing app and to complete a questionnaire in the app every evening for 14 days. And the app included a module of background questions that were just asked on the first day. Then there was a set of daily questions about the experiences, stresses, relationships, well-being. And then on the 14th day, there was a short debrief module. And respondents were promised £1 for every day on which they completed the survey. And so we invited them to this study within the annual interview. And then immediately after the interview, we also sent them a reminder with their personal login details for signing into the app. So we experimented with 3 different aspects. The first was where in the annual interview we invited them to this additional app study. So the annual interview is on average 40 minutes. Half the sample were invited to the mobile study after a few early modules. So early on in the interview, the other half were invited right at the end of these 40 minutes. So that was the first experiment. The second one was with the length of the daily questionnaire. So for each of these 14 days, half the sample were told that the questionnaire every day would be on average 2 minutes, and the other half were told that it would be 10 minutes every day. And then the third experiment was with the bonus. So everybody got £1 for every day on which they completed the survey. And then a third got no additional bonus. A third were told that they would get £10 if they completed every day. And another third were told that they could get up to an additional £10 if they completed every day. So what happened here was that we randomly pre-selected 4 days, and if they happened to complete the app on that day, they got a pop-up message saying, "Congratulations, you've earned another £2.50. So these experiments, the position, obviously that just happened. They were asked early or late, but then the length of the daily questionnaire and the bonus incentive, they were highlighted within the invitation. So people were told, this is how long it'll take, this is what you'll get. So the treatment groups were equally split, and they're stratified across these 3 experiments. So this is using the Understanding Society Innovation Patent Panel sample. This is a household panel, a probability sample in Great Britain, where we interview all household members aged 16 and over. And in 2020, we had 81% of respondents completed this annual interview online, and 19% completed it over the telephone. We had a total of over 2,200 respondents who were eligible for the Wellbeing App study, and eligibility just depended on whether we knew these people were in our sample households. So for everybody who we knew was living in a sample household, we prepared the login details for the app and they were invited. So this includes people who joined households since we'd previously interviewed the household. This also means that we invited everybody in the sample, so even respondents who've told us in the past that they don't have a smartphone or they don't use the internet. So we invited everybody. And so again, in the invitation to the mobile app study, so we emphasize these different experimental treatments. So in the analysis, we're looking at the effects of these experimental treatments, first of all, on participation and app use. And there are different ways of looking at this. So first of all, within the annual interview, we invited people to the app study, and then we immediately asked them to self-report whether they had managed to download and log into the app or not. So that's the first outcome. Do they self-report that they've downloaded the app? Then we look at the actual app data. So do we have data from at least one day? And then for those people who use the app at least once, we look at the number of days they use the app and just a binary indicator of whether or not they completed all 14 days. So that's the different outcomes of whether they use the app or not. And then we also look at the reasons they gave us. So within the annual interview, we asked them to download the app. And if they said they hadn't, we asked why. And we look at whether that differs between the experimental groups. And then we also look at biases between participants and non-participants and how those differ between the experimental treatments. So the first experiment is with the bonus incentive. So here, if we look at the self-report, whether they said they downloaded the app, we do see a difference between these bonus incentive groups. So the group who were promised £10 if they completed every day, 42% of that group said yes, they downloaded and logged into the app, compared to 37% in the 2 other bonus groups. But when we look at the actual app data, we no longer see a difference between these treatment groups, and we also don't see any differences in the number of days that users use the app. So that's the first experiment. The second is with the length of the daily survey. So here the green bar is the 2-minute group. So here, if we look at the self-report, 42% of people in the 2-minute group said they downloaded the app, compared to 36% in the 10-minute group. And that difference is a bit smaller and less significant, but it does carry through. So when we look at the actual app data, we still see a difference. But when we look at app users, we see no difference between these treatment groups in how many days they use the app. So it's not the case that for those who it was 10 minutes that they were more likely to drop out of this. It's not the case. So then the last experiment was where in the annual interview we invited people to the app study. And here the green bar, we see that when we invited them early on, 44% that they said they downloaded the app, compared to 33% of those who we invited late, so at the end of the annual interview. And that also carries forward. So when we look at the actual app data, we still see that difference. So we get higher participation rates when we ask people early on in the annual interview to do this additional task. And then there's a small difference also in the average number of days. So this is just a half a day, not much, but a small difference. So these are the effects of the experimental treatments on the participation, different aspects of participation. Then next we look at the reasons why they said they didn't download the app. So this is asked again during the interview, immediately after the invitation. So first of all, for the full sample, so 3% of respondents said they were concerned about security. So this is just asked of people who didn't download the app. And they could give multiple answers. So 3% said it was because of concerns about security. Some people said they didn't have internet, didn't have storage space, just not willing to share information. They can't download apps. They don't have a smartphone or tablet. That's 14%. Not interested, no time, 19%. And then a large share, 32%, who just said they don't want to do anything additional for the survey. So that's overall the full sample. When we look at this by experimental treatment groups, generally we don't see any differences. There's one exception, which is that for the incentive treatments, we see a difference in the proportion who said they're not willing to share information. So those who were not offered a bonus, 14% said they didn't download the app because they were not willing to share this information. And that proportion was lower in the other two incentive groups. But generally, not really any differences between the different experimental treatment groups in the reasons for not downloading the app. And then finally, non-participation bias. So here we've looked at differences between the full sample and those who actually use the app. And this, first of all, is for the full sample. So the app users overrepresent the groups in this box on the left: women, younger age groups, more educated, married, parents, healthy people in paid work, smartphone users, and those who already use health apps for their personal use. We didn't find any differences in home ownership status or whether they're currently smoking. So this is overall for the full sample. And then again, to look at the different experimental treatment groups, what we've done is we've calculated average absolute bias overall, and then for each of the separate treatment groups. So for the 13 variables that we've looked at so far, we look at each of the different categories, so 37 categories over all those variables. And then for each category, we calculate the difference in the proportion, say the proportion of women in the full sample and the proportion of women among app users. We take the absolute value of that difference, and then we calculate the mean across these 37 categories. And so overall in the full sample, we see an average absolute bias of 3.1 percentage points. And then we see a bit of variation between the experimental groups. So the ones in red here, the incentive group with the random days and the short daily survey, the 2 minutes, they have a lower average absolute bias of 2.8 compared to the other groups. But my interpretation of this is that this is relatively little variation. So the bias doesn't seem to differ much between the experimental treatment groups. And actually, when you look at the full tables and the distributions of characteristics, also they're broadly similar between these groups. So to conclude, in this scenario where we're inviting respondents in an annual interview, as part of the annual interview, we're inviting them to do something additional using a mobile app. So first of all, this was not experimental, but we see that this reminder email where we send out the app login details again by email after the invitation helps. So in all experimental treatment groups, we see that in the app data, we get more cases than there are people who initially said they downloaded the app. So the reminders help. The bonus incentives, the length of the daily survey, those affected whether or not people immediately said they downloaded the app or not. But when we look at the actual use, so the actual app data, we don't see any differences. And here one caveat is that in the reminder email, we didn't remind people of those treatments. So maybe if we had, we could have still seen differences between the treatment groups in the actual app data. The position of the invitation, that does affect compliance, and this is very interesting. We see a similar result when we look at consent to data linkage. When we ask late at the end of the survey, we get lower consent rates than we ask early. And also, we have more people at the end saying the reason they didn't consent was because this was too personal. I've shared enough information with this survey already. And so it looks as though a similar thing might be happening here with this mobile app study, that when we're asking them at the end of this 40-minute interview to then download this app, people are more likely to feel they've done enough for the survey. They don't want to do this. And then finally, the experimental treatments that we've tested, they don't really affect the reasons that people give for why they didn't download the app. And they also have little effect on non-participation bias. So that's all from me. Thank you very much for listening.